Steiner's Epistemology. In this presentation, I aim to share the essential points of Steiner's Epistemology, quoting freely from his work Truth and Knowledge. After some brief opening remarks, he moves rapidly into a critical examination of Kant's epistemology, the cornerstone of epistemology at the time. In order to appreciate Steiner's examination, we need to consider two central concepts in Kant's seminal work, his Critique of Pure Reason, two concepts that gave him the assurance of certainty in his massive endeavor. Firstly, synthetic judgments, and secondly, knowledge a priori. For Kant, a judgment is synthetic when, to quote him, the concept of the predicate brings to the concept of the subject something which lies completely outside the subject, although it stands in connection with the subject. End of quote. An example of a synthetical judgment would be a triangle has co-interior angles totaling 180 degrees. In this example, you could not have derived this assertion from the subject alone. Kant contrasts this with what he calls analytical judgments, in which the predicate B is self-evident and applied or contained in the subject A. For example, a triangle has three sides. Now to move on to knowledge a priori. What Kant means by this can be found in the following quotation from his book. By the term knowledge a priori, we shall in the sequel understand not such knowledge as is independent of this or that kind of experience, but such as is absolutely so of all experience. End of quote. In other words, knowledge a priori is a knowledge that does not suffer in any way from the vagaries of our subjective experiences, which Kant was determined to avoid. Steiner begins his investigations by focusing on this double structure of Kant's epistemology. I will now quote Steiner at some length. He says, Kant's fundamental question concerning epistemology is, how are synthetical judgments a priori possible? Let us begin by considering whether or not this question is free of presuppositions. Kant formulates it because he believes that we can arrive at certain unconditional knowledge only if we can prove the validity of synthetical judgments a priori. He says, to quote Kant, in the solution of the above problem is comprehended at the same time the possibility of the use of pure reason in the foundation and construction of all sciences. Upon the solution of this problem depends the existence or downfall of the science of metaphysics. End of quote. Steiner goes on. Is this problem, as Kant formulates it, free of all presuppositions? No, not at all, for it says that a system of absolute certain knowledge can be erected only on a foundation of judgments that are synthetical and acquired independently of all experience. But it is conceivable, after all, that such judgments might not even exist. A theory of knowledge must leave open to begin with the question of whether we can arrive at a judgment solely by means of experience, or by some other means as well. Indeed, to an unprejudiced mind, it must seem that for something to be independent of all experience in this way is impossible. For whatever object we are concerned to know, we must become aware of it directly and individually. That is, it must become experience. We acquire mathematical judgments too, only through direct experience of particular single examples. This is the case even if we regard them as rooted in a certain faculty of our consciousness. Irrespective of whether the content of such a proposition contains elements which guarantee its absolute validity, or whether it is certain for other reasons, the fact remains that we cannot make it our own unless at some stage it becomes experience for us. This is the first objection to Kant's question. The second consists in the fact that at the beginning of a theoretical investigation of knowledge, one ought not to maintain that no valid and absolute knowledge can be obtained by means of experience. For surely it is conceivable that experience itself could contain some characteristic feature which would guarantee the validity of insight gained by means of it. Two presuppositions are thus contained in Kant's formulation of the question. One presupposition is that we need other means of gaining knowledge besides experience. And the second is that all knowledge gained through experience is only approximately valid. Dogmatic philosophy assumes these presuppositions to be valid, and simply uses them to arrive at knowledge accordingly. Kant makes the same assumptions and merely inquires under what conditions they are valid. But suppose they are not valid at all. In that case, the edifice of Kant's doctrine has no foundation whatever. These assertions must definitely be preceded by an examination both of the nature of experience and of knowledge. Steiner now outlines what he considers to be an appropriate point of departure for an epistemology, one that avoids preconceptions. To do so, he makes a very clear distinction between the process of directing our focus and the process of making assertions or drawing conclusions from the focus. This is a distinct two-step process. To quote Steiner further, every theory of knowledge must first lead the reader to where the starting point, free of all presuppositions, is to be found. For what we possess as knowledge at any moment in our life is far removed from this point, and we must first be led back to it artificially. In actual fact, it is a necessity for every epistemologist to come to such a purely didactic arrangement concerning the starting point of this science. But this must always be limited merely to showing to what extent the starting point for cognition really is the absolute start. It must be presented in purely self-evident, analytical sentences, and unlike Kant's argument, contain no assertions which will influence the content of the subsequent discussion. It is also incumbent on the epistemologist to show that his starting point is really free of all presuppositions. All this, however, has nothing to do with the nature of the starting point itself, but is quite independent of it, and makes no assertions about it. The epistemologist must show in his introductory remarks how one can arrive at a starting point free of all presuppositions. Yet the actual content of the starting point must be quite independent of these considerations. However, anyone who, like Kant, makes definite dogmatic assertions at the very outset is certainly very far from fulfilling these conditions when he introduces his theory of knowledge. Steiner now proceeds with a consideration of the uncritical, naive experience of reality and the features of the directly given world picture, to use his phrase. He goes on, the view which accepts the reality of our directly given picture of the world as certain and beyond doubt is usually called naive realism. Naive realism is the viewpoint from which we all start. It is therefore the proper starting point for a critical investigation. By recognizing its shortcomings, we shall be led to the right path. A brief comment on the concept of naive is necessary here. Dühring tries to define this concept in his essay, concerning the concept of naive realism. He says the following: the concept naive designates the 0 point in the scale of reflection about one's own relation to what one is doing. A naive content may well be correct, for although it is unreflecting and therefore simply non-critical or uncritical, this lack of reflection and criticism excludes the objective assurance of truth and includes the possibility and danger of error, yet by no means necessitates them. To be naive means to be in all spheres of life what the root of the word nativus implies, that is, unconscious, impulsive, instinctive. This ends Dühring's quote. Starting from this, we must endeavor to define naive still more precisely. In all our activities, two things must be taken into account: the activity itself and our knowledge of its laws. It is possible to observe oneself and inquire into the laws inherent in one's own activity, thus abandoning the naive consciousness just described through knowing exactly the scope of and justification for what one does. This I shall call critical. I believe this definition comes nearest to the meaning of this concept as it has been used in philosophy with greater or lesser clarity ever since Kant. Critical reflection, then, is the opposite of the naive approach. A critical attitude is one that comes to grips with the laws of its own activity in order to discover their reliability and limits. Epistemology can only be a critical science, for its object is an essentially subjective activity of man, cognition, and it wishes to demonstrate the laws inherent in cognition. Thus, everything naive must be excluded from this science. Its strength must lie in thinking about thinking. If a theory of knowledge is really to explain the whole sphere of knowledge, then it must start from something still quite untouched by the activity of thinking, and what is more, from something which lends to this activity its first impulse. This starting point must lie outside the act of cognition. It must not itself be knowledge, but it must be sought immediately prior to cognition, so that the very next step we take beyond it is the activity of cognition. This absolute starting point must be determined in such a way that it admits nothing already derived from cognition. Only our directly given world picture can offer such a starting point, that is, that picture of the world which presents itself to man before he has subjected it to the process of knowledge in any way, before he has asserted or decided anything at all about it by means of thinking. This directly given picture is what flits past us, disconnected, but still undifferentiated. Differentiation of the given indistinct world picture into distinct entities is already an act of thought activity. In it nothing appears distinguished from, related to, or determined by anything else. At this stage, so to speak, no object or event is yet more important or significant than any other. The most rudimentary organ of an animal, which, in the light of further knowledge, may turn out to be quite unimportant for its development and life, appears before us with the same claims for our attention as the noblest and most essential part of the organism. Before our conceptual activity begins, the world picture contains neither substance, quality, nor cause and effect. Distinctions between matter and spirit, body and soul, do not yet exist. Furthermore, any other predicate must also be excluded from the world picture at this stage. This picture can be considered neither as reality nor as appearance, neither subjective nor objective, neither as chance nor as necessity. Whether it is thing in itself or mere representation cannot be decided at this stage. For as we have seen, knowledge of physics and physiology, which leads to a classification of the given under one or the other of the above headings, cannot be a basis for a theory of knowledge. As an aside, we can be reminded here of Oliver Sacks' description of some people's deep distress after gaining sight for the first time after an eye operation. Some are alarmed and overwhelmed by the impression of an unfamiliar and initially quite disconnected new totality. To go on with Steiner, if a being with a fully developed human intelligence were suddenly created out of nothing, and then confronted the world, the first impression made on his senses and his thinking would be something like what I have just characterized as the directly given world picture. In practice, man never encounters this world picture in this form at any time in his life. He never experiences a division between a purely passive awareness of the directly giving and a thinking recognition of it. Any predicates must be carefully removed from the world picture so that it can be considered free of anything introduced through the process of knowledge. This division between the given and the known will not in fact coincide with any stage of human development. The boundary must be drawn artificially. But this can be done at every level of development, so long as we draw the dividing line correctly between what confronts us free of all conceptual definitions and what cognition subsequently makes of it. What we have extracted by means of thought does not characterize the directly given world picture, nor define nor express anything about it. What it does is to guide our attention to the dividing line where the starting point for cognition is to be found. The question of truth or error, correctness or incorrectness, does not enter into the statement, which is concerned with the moment preceding the point where a theory of knowledge begins. It serves merely to guide us deliberately to this starting point. No one proceeding to consider epistemological questions could possibly be said to be standing at the starting point of cognition, for he already possesses a certain amount of knowledge. To remove from this all that has been contributed by cognition, and to establish a precognitive starting point, can only be done conceptually. But such concepts are not of value as knowledge. They have the purely negative function of removing from sight all that belongs to knowledge and of leading us to the point where knowledge begins. These considerations act as signposts pointing to where the act of cognition first appears, but at this stage do not themselves form part of the act of cognition. Whatever the epistemologist proposes in order to establish his starting point raises to begin with no question of truth or error, but only of its suitability for the task. From the starting point too, all error is excluded, for error can only begin with cognition, and therefore cannot arise before cognition sets in. Only a theory of knowledge that starts from considerations of this kind can claim to observe this last principle. For if the starting point is some object or subject to which is attached any conceptual definition, then the possibility of error is already present in the starting point, namely in the definition itself. Justification of the definition will then depend upon the laws inherent in the act of cognition. But these laws can be discovered only in the course of the epistemological investigation itself. Error is wholly excluded only by saying, I eliminate from my world picture all conceptual definitions arrived at through cognition, and retain only what enters my field of observation without any activity on my part. When on principle I refrain from making any statement, I cannot make a mistake. Steiner now makes the important point that it is not our senses but our concepts and conclusions that are prone to error. We are mistaken when we say our senses can deceive us, for the error lies not in the sense perception, but in a loose or prejudiced cognitive interpretation of the perception. Our perceptions as given are in fact quite dumb, and in themselves reveal no inner content or meaning. This becomes obvious only when we confront the totally unfamiliar, because normally we make a rapid mental association. Any conceptual content, association, or conclusion, true or false, is contributed by our thinking alone, and not by our senses. Steiner goes on. Error in relation to knowledge, that is, epistemologically, can occur only within the act of cognition. Sense deceptions are not errors. That the moon upon rising appears larger than it does at its zenith is not an error, but a fact governed by the laws of nature. A mistake in knowledge would only occur if, in using thinking to combine the given perceptions, we misrepresented larger and smaller. But this interpretation is part of the act of cognition. To understand cognition exactly in all its details, its origin and starting point must first be grasped. It is clear, furthermore, that what precedes this preliminary starting point must not be included in an explanation of cognition, but must be presupposed. Investigation of the essence of what is here presumed is the task of the various branches of scientific knowledge. The present aim, however, is not to acquire specific knowledge of this or that element, but to investigate cognition itself. Until we have understood the act of knowledge, we cannot judge the significance of statements about the content of the world arrived at through the act of cognition. This is why the directly given is not defined, as long as the relation of such a definition to what is defined is not known. Even the concept directly given includes no statement about what precedes cognition. Its only purpose is to point to this given, to turn our attention to it. At the starting point of a theory of knowledge, the concept is only the first initial relation between cognition and the world content. This description even allows for the possibility that the total world content would turn out to be only a figment of our own I, which would mean that extreme subjectivism would be true. Subjectivism is not something that exists as given. It can only be a conclusion drawn from considerations based on cognition. That is, it would have to be confirmed by the theory of knowledge. It could not be assumed as its basis. This directly given world content includes everything that enters our experience in the widest sense: sensations, perceptions, opinions, feelings, deeds, pictures of dreams and imaginations, representations, concepts and ideas. Illusions and hallucinations too, at this stage, are equal to the rest of the world content, for their relation to other perceptions can be revealed only through observation based on cognition. When epistemology starts from the assumption that all the elements just mentioned constitute the content of our consciousness, the following question immediately arises. How is it possible for us to go beyond our consciousness and recognize actual existence? When such an assumption is not made, the situation is different. Both consciousness and the representation of the I are, to begin with, only parts of the directly given, and the relationship of the latter to the two former must be discovered by means of cognition. Here Steiner makes a central point in his argument. He says, cognition is not to be defined in terms of consciousness, but vice versa. Both consciousness and the relation between subject and object are defined in terms of cognition. Steiner puts this central thought in other words in his later Philosophy of Freedom in the following way. The subject does not think because it is a subject. Rather, it appears to itself as subject because it can think. He goes on focusing on the given. Since the given is left without predicate to begin with, the question arises as to how it is defined at all. How can any start be made with cognition? How does one part of the world picture come to be designated as perception and the other as concept? One thing as existence, another as appearance. This as cause and that as effect. How is it that we can separate ourselves from what is objective and regard ourselves as I in contrast to the not I? We must find a bridge from the world picture as given to that other world picture which we build up by means of cognition. Here, however, we meet with the following difficulty. As long as we merely stare passively at the given, we shall never find a point of attack where we can gain a foothold, and from where we can proceed with cognition. Somewhere in the given, we must find a place where we can set to work, where something exists which is akin to cognition. If everything were really only given, we could do no more than merely stare into the external world and stare indifferently into the inner world of our individuality. We would at most be able to describe things as something external to us. We should never be able to understand them. Our concepts would have a purely external relation to that which they referred. They would not be inwardly related to it. For real cognition depends on finding a sphere somewhere in the given, where our cognizing activity does not merely presuppose something given, but finds itself active in the very essence of the given. In other words, precisely through strict adherence to the given as merely given, it must become apparent that not everything is given. Insistence on the given alone must lead to the discovery of something which goes beyond the given. The reason for so insisting is not to establish some arbitrary starting point for a theory of knowledge, but to discover the true one. In this sense, the given also includes what according to its very nature is not given. The latter would appear to begin with as formally part of the given, but on closer scrutiny would reveal its true nature of its own accord. It is a characteristic feature of all the rest of our world picture that it must be given if we are to experience it. The only case in which the opposite occurs is that of concepts and ideas. These we must produce if we are to experience them. Concepts and ideas alone are given us in a form that could be called intellectual seeing. Kant and the later philosophers who follow in his steps completely deny this ability to man, because it is said that all thinking refers only to objects and does not itself produce anything. In intellectual seeing, the content must be contained within the thought form itself. But is this not precisely the case with pure concepts and ideas? By concept, I mean a principle according to which the disconnected elements of perception become joined into a unity. Causality, for example, is a concept. An idea is a concept with a greater content. Organism, considered quite abstractly as an idea. However, they must be considered in the form which they possess while still quite free of any empirical content. If, for example, the pure idea of causality is to be grasped, then one must not choose a particular instance of causality, or the sum total of all causality. It is essential to take hold of the pure concept, causality. Cause and effect must be sought in the world, but before we can discover it in the world, we ourselves must first produce causality as a thought form. If one clings to the Kantian assertion that of themselves concepts are empty, it would be impossible to use concepts to determine anything about the given world. Suppose two elements of the world content were given, A and B. If I am to find a relation between them, I must do so with the help of a principle, which has a definite content. I can only produce this principle myself in the act of cognition. I cannot derive it from the objects, for the definition of the objects is only to be obtained by means of the principle. Thus, a principle by means of which we define objects belongs entirely to the conceptual sphere alone. Before proceeding further, a possible objection must be considered. It might appear that this discussion is unconsciously introducing the representation of the I of the personal subject, and is using it without first justifying it. For example, in statements like, we produce concepts, or we insist on this or that. But in fact, my explanation contains nothing which implies that such statements are more than turns of phrase. As shown earlier, the fact that the act of cognition depends upon and proceeds from an I can be established only through considerations which themselves make use of cognition. Thus, to begin with, the discussion must be limited to the act of cognition alone, without considering the cognizing subject. All that has been established thus far is the fact that something given exists, and that somewhere in this given, the above described postulate arises. And lastly, that this postulate corresponds to the sphere of concepts and ideas. This is not to deny that its source is the I, but these two initial steps in the theory of knowledge must first be defined in their pure form. Concepts and ideas, therefore, comprise part of the given, and at the same time lead beyond it. This makes it possible to define what other activity is concerned in attaining knowledge. Through a postulate, we have separated from the rest of the world, or the given world picture, a particular part of it. This is done because it lies in the nature of cognition to start from just this particular part. Thus we separated it out, only to enable us to understand the act of cognition. In so doing, it must be clear that we have artificially torn apart the unity of the world picture. We must realize that what we have separated out from the given has an essential connection with the world content, irrespective of our postulate. This provides the next step in the theory of knowledge. It must consist in restoring that unity which we tore apart in order to make knowledge possible. The act of restoration consists in thinking about the world as given. Our thinking consideration of the world brings about the actual union of the two parts of the world content. The part we survey as given on the horizon of our experience, and the part which has to be produced in the act of cognition, before that can be given also. The act of cognition is the synthesis of these two elements. Indeed, in every single act of cognition, one part appears as something produced within the act itself and through the act, as added to the merely given. This part, in actual fact, is always so produced, and only appears as something given at the beginning of an epistemological theory. At this point, Steiner makes a second crucial point regarding thinking. Not only is it that which determines myself as a subject, but it is the one and only part of the given that holds no riddle, unlike every other aspect of the given which needs interpretation. No one has ever had to explain our thoughts to us. He goes on. To permeate the world as given, with concepts and ideas, is a thinking consideration of things. Therefore, thinking is the act which mediates knowledge. It is only when thinking arranges the world picture by means of its own activity that knowledge can come about. Thinking itself is an activity which in the moment of cognition produces a content of its own. Therefore, insofar as the content that is cognized issues from thinking, it contains no problem for cognition. We have only to observe it. The very nature of what we observe is given us directly. A description of thinking is also at the same time the knowledge or science of thinking. Logic too has always been a description of thought forms, but as such it is never a science that proves anything. With thinking, all proof ceases. For proof presupposes thinking. One may be able to prove a particular fact, but one can never prove proof as such. We can only describe what a proof is. In logic, all theory is pure empiricism. In the science of logic, there is only observation. But when we want to know something other than thinking, we can do so only with the help of thinking. This means that thinking has to approach something given and transform its chaotic relationship with the world picture into a systematic one. This means that thinking approaches the given world as an organizing principle. The process takes place as follows. Thinking first lifts out certain entities from the totality of the world whole. In the given, nothing is really separate. Everything is a connected continuum. Then thinking relates these separate entities to each other in accordance with the thought forms it produces, and also determines the outcome of this relationship. When thinking restores a relationship between two separate sections of the world content, it does not do so arbitrarily. Thinking waits for what comes to light of its own accord as the result of restoring the relationship, and it is this result alone which is knowledge of that particular section of the world content. If the latter were unable to express anything about itself through that particular relationship established by thinking, then this attempt made by thinking would fail, and would have to try again. All knowledge depends on man's establishing a correct relationship between two or more elements of reality and comprehending the result of this. There is no doubt many of our attempts to grasp things by means of thinking fail. This is apparent not only in the history of science, but also in ordinary life. It is just that in the simple cases we usually encounter, the right concept replaces the wrong one so quickly that we seldom or never become aware of the latter. We must now ask what part thinking plays in building up our scientific world picture, in contrast to the merely given world picture. Our discussion shows that thinking provides the thought forms to which the laws that govern the world correspond. In the example given above, let us assume A to be the cause of B, the effect. And from this it follows that no cognition can have a content which is a priori. in that it is established prior to observation, or thinking divorced from the given. Rather must the content be acquired wholly through observation. In this sense, all our knowledge is empirical. Now, to conclude, I will end with this quotation from the last pages of his chapter, Epistemological Conclusion. Should the skeptic maintain that our cognitive thinking can never approach the world, he can only maintain this with the help of thinking, and in so doing refutes himself. Whoever attempts to establish doubt in thinking by means of thinking itself admits by implication that thinking contains a power strong enough to support a conviction. Lastly, our theory of knowledge transcends both one-sided empiricism and one-sided rationalism by uniting them at a higher level. In this way, justice is done to both. Empiricism is justified by showing that, as far as content is concerned, all knowledge of the given is to be attained only through direct contact with the given. And it will be found that this view also does justice to rationalism, in that thinking is declared to be both the necessary and only mediator of knowledge. End of quote. The ethical consequence of Steiner's epistemology will be addressed separately. Not surprisingly, it challenges the core of Kant's categorical imperative.